So now let me begin by giving thanks to those who made this event possible, to the team at 10 Square for this lovely venue, and to Equal Dreams for providing sign language interpretation for our guests here and online. And of course for our poets and panelists for joining us to celebrate Wong May. So before I introduce the panel, let me give a brief introduction to Wong May. You may be wondering why are we having a book launch without the author here. This is because Wong May has been famously private and prefers for her work to speak for itself, and she shies away from the limelight. She also lives in Ireland with her husband and children. A Bad Girl's Book of Animals is her first collection of poetry, which was published by Harcourt, Brace and World in 1969. And we are very honored to be reissuing and bringing Wong May's poetry back to Singapore. Her other books include Reports, Superstitions, and Picasso's Tears. And her latest work is a collection of translations called In the Same Light, 210 Poems for Our Century. And in March last year, she won the Windham-Campbell Prize for poetry. So you get a better sense of Wong May as a poet and her poetry when you hear the panelists discuss her poetry. And now I'd like to take the chance to introduce our panelists. We have Anne Ang, who is a literary researcher and published writer, best known as the author of Bang Naka. She published her first book of poetry called Burning Walls for Paper Spirits in 2021. A keen birder, and also researches contemporary Anglophone writing from Southeast Asia and South Asia. We have Jennifer Ann Champion. She has published 2 collections of poetry and has been featured in numerous anthologies in Singapore and abroad. She is the co-founder of Poetry.sg and served as its multimedia editor. So currently Jennifer's practice is grounded in slow crafts and mindfulness. She was a digital writer in residence with the National Centre for Writing in the UK for her work in poetry and textiles. And her poetry and textile works have been on display with Art Outreach Singapore and NUS EMCC. And we have our moderator and editor of this collection, Tse Hao Guang. He's the author of the International Left-Hand Calligraphy Association and Deeds of Light. The latter was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize. And apart from the Bad Girl's Book of Animals, he's also edited anthologies such as Food, Republic, and Unfree Verse. And he's also the editor of the e-journal of Zeus. Poems and essays appear in Poetry, Poem a Day, the Yale Review, Poetry Northwest, Entropy, and elsewhere. So Hao Guang will be moderating the session for us today, and we'll be opening with opening remarks from Hao Guang, followed by a 40-minute reading and a post-reading conversation with the panel. And we will then move into Q&A for the last 15 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, there will be a QR code to scan, or you can go to slido.com/wongmay to send in your questions, or we could also just pass around the mic later. So without further ado, over to you, Hao Guang.
Thank you. So I just want to thank Erin for that lovely introduction. Thank you also to everyone at Ethos for bringing this book to life, to relife, to resurrect this book. For a long time, I think I wasn't sure that any publisher would ever be willing to take on this book at all. I think there's a sort of, there's a measure of foolishness, I think, inherent in publishing and writing any kind of poetry today, much less the kind of poetry that Wong May has written. And so I think Ethos has sort of like, agreed to my foolishness, and said okay to my foolishness. And I think it gives all of us, including those who write poetry, hope, in the sense that even if our voices are not, they sort of go out of fashion, or they are not heard anymore for many, many years, still the chance remains for our voices to come back to life. And I think that's what this book, part of what this book means to me at least. So I hope that our encounters with this book, as we read it, as it's encountered by members of the general public, the general reading public, that they will that will change how we see and receive things, that don't easily fit in, that it will enlarge what we expect when we think about poetry or Singapore poetry. And it will also help us to learn from an artist, Wong May, who keeps telling us not to look at her, the person, but to look at her words instead. And I hope that this excitement around Wong May's republication will snowball. I hope that this will lead to opportunities for the next 2 early books, Reports and Superstitions, to be republished as well. I remain certain that this will happen, just a matter of when. I think that is pretty much what I have to say, and I think what I want to do is to move on to the poems themselves. I'm not sure who I should ask, so maybe what I'll do is, I think maybe Anne could read first, and then I'll go next, and then Jennifer the third, in order of reading, mostly because Jen has a special, exciting presentation. I'm very excited.
The expectations.
Yeah, so maybe Anne first.
So I'll go first, and the poems I'm reading are fittingly the first 2 poems in the book to give everyone a flavor of it. On his 23rd birthday, in his country they use water, hyacinths to feed pigs. Imagine the stuff pigs are made of. He lies in bed thinking this is but a zone of his life, as if life has zones. The purple flood, that is, if consciousness is in streams. He gets up, eats a can of sardines, and buries himself. He knows himself too well already. He hears his voice in another country, softly. Women would say, after all these years, you haven't changed a bit. The telephone rings. History. The lie that snow was here yesterday up to my very door. The lie that though a brief thing it was. The lie that I've got a mother, I've committed murder, I've recovered, I couldn't have wakened to a final world. I carry you with me now, child and mother. The weight of snow, sleep, walking down the steps across the street. It is October 1967. Everywhere the sun and water, we are going steadilier in water. That's it.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to read from dialogue. I'm jumping all over the place. So in the new edition, it's page 41 for those who have the dialogue. Said the moon at 4 o'clock. Have you ever been loved by a woman, love armless? But love is harmless. Form is a bottle of bones, form pure, incorruptible, flesh, the jelly where flies die. My fingers lie against the cool glass of window, of mirror, pink, curled, gentle like shelled shrimps. Flesh itself died in the bottle, is preserved in the form of a bottle. I offer you this, a room. Love is a room, you said, yours. Honey in my eyes, honey trickles from my ears. The sun itself would have come in, had it not been the sun, terrified. The next one is Concordance on page 76. And I like this because Anne was saying, Wong May seems to be laughing a lot in her poetry. She's laughing at it. Concordance. He grows pale, seeing that she cannot. Her way of paling is to laugh like bottles, jostling against one another in water, in perfect emptiness, ringing clear like a thrush. She grows pale, seeing that he cannot. His way of paling is to look literally like a peeled onion. She rings and tilts her head till tears gather in her eyes. Lacking, he finds himself on the brim, waiting. And the last one, the second last poem of the book, it's called Remember, on page 120. Remember. Remember my right hand to your right hand. Remember my eye to your eye. Remember what I could not have to what you have kept. Remember the symmetry, the beauty, where exactly we cut ourselves into two halves of a peach, of a fish. Remember my flesh to your flesh, all our pores listening like muffled ears. Remember to each our essential selfishness, the bridge that isn't anywhere. Remember my breath to your breath for no reason, this rhythm, this perfection. All right.
Yes, I need several mics. I need 2 mics. But while that's going on, I'm going to read a poem first. So this poem is called Narration, and it is on page 45. All my beautiful young men going down the drain, the bats, trout, goats, the grinder sink gargles, forwarding address not for deposit of mail. I've spent the whole summer in the animal hospital, myself recovering to them, myself recovering fur, fin, fangs, claws, all my beautiful young parts dance together. Go swish, swash, swoop down the drain, the reason for wasting so much good whiskey. This is a way of telling a story. Wash it down your throat. Right, so that's the first one. And then I need the mic. Switch mics so that I can put this here, because what happened was this morning I woke up and flipped through the book and came upon the poem called Song. And I don't know why, I just felt like it would be nice in honor of Wong May to make her song a song. So that is what I have done. And I'm going to need some audience participation. Okay? Hello? So I'm going to be making some animal sounds during the song performance. And if you could also make some animal sounds with me, whatever secret animal is inside you that wants to make a sound, you can make a sound. Okay? All right. This could go really badly. Okay. Do you want to practice actually making the sounds?
Yeah.
So I do this with my poetry students, my younger ones. I tell them to make an alien sound that comes from their chest in response to a question. So Hao Guang asked me, how am I doing today?
How are you doing today?
So that's the kind of sound that you can make. Don't worry about whether it makes sense or not. I believe that poets are very interested in sound, and even though there's no word attached, because Wong May has been spoken of as a poet who has an enigmatic wordlessness, right? I think she would appreciate having these sounds form her song. Okay? All right, let's go. I said, you can have my 5 senses, 5 animals on a leash. do not come and find me. But just when did you leave your fine animals with me? I said, do not come and find me. But just when did you leave your fine animals with me? Thank you so much. All right, while I have the guitar here, I'm going to try another one. I have no idea how Wong May is going to feel about this. Let's see.
I'm sure she'll do.
Yeah, I hope so. I really do. Okay. This one is completely improvised, and it's a poem that I promised to read, which is called Shadow. Okay. Your shadow tells me you are not doing this. Your shadow tells me that you are not doing this. Do I trust you? What do you think of what you're doing? Just how happy or unhappy do you want yourself to be? To me and me and me. I want to be. I want to be. I want to be. To be. The wall where your shadows tell me you are not doing this. The wall where your shadow tells me you are not doing this. Thank you.
We should have a mic session.
Maybe we should skip the Q&A and just have Jen
Yes, I'll sing.
sing for the rest of the evening.
I'm not prepared for that.
Yeah, so I think this next part is basically a little dialogue. We have prepared some questions I prepared some questions for Anne and Jen. But if you guys also have questions or you don't have reactions, because these are questions I think I pose to readers, and if you've read the poems before, feel free to answer as well. And so this is the first question, kind of like establishing question. When did you first encounter Wong May's poetry? Especially this book, The Bamboo Book of Animals, and what has it meant? How did it make you feel? And I think the context of this is that this is a book that was first published in 1969, right? I'm not sure how many of us in this room know about that era firsthand.
So I guess I first encountered Wong May about 2 years ago, and I was very fortunate that the university I work at actually had the first edition, the 1969 version of it. And the reason why I encountered Wong May was that she had been making quite a bit of news with the Windham-Campbell Prize and also a new book of translations of Tang poetry. But I also found out that at some point she spent quite a bit of time in Singapore, at least at the start of the career. I said, I have not heard of this Singapore poet before, so-called Singapore poet. And it's a poet, I think, she is a poet that challenges us to expand our idea of what Singapore is beyond a sort of national framework. But when I read her poetry, that was not something I actually had in mind, because it's like nothing I've ever read before. You think that it would be part of a tradition, you think that you could easily relate it to a sort of national tradition, but no, it's nothing like that at all. And it has a radical simplicity. So when I read it, it's like a nursery rhyme. They're like nursery rhymes turned inside out. And I didn't think they were from the 1960s at all, which is the challenge that poetry issues to us. It doesn't have to be of a place or of a time, and yet could be still read in relation to that place or time as well. So yeah, I think encountering Wong May is a sort of broader encounter with poetry, and sort of it changed my mind about what it could be, I think.
I came across a Bad Girls Book of Animals 2 years ago as well, and Ethos is not going to like it, but I got it through as a bootleg copy. So I did have a physical copy of the book, and it was sent to me, but I was reading it at the point when I was on residency working on textiles and poetry, and I was also encountering it at the same time as encountering another person named Lorena Bulwer. Lorena Bulwer was an inmate in an English asylum in the late 1800s who wrote long stream of conscious words, letters basically, to anyone and no one, to everyone in her town, and how much she hated them. And the contrast between this massive amount of endless flowing words versus Wong May's very tight and deliberate use of words. It struck me that there was a similar kind of irritation with society that I could see in Wong May's book and also in Lorena Bulwer's samplers. And it was just very interesting to me that both women, separated by time, separated by culture, separated by aesthetics even, were still writing from the same place. Yeah.
I think the next question leads from the title of this event, which is like wordlessness and something like that. And basically Wong May has described her own work, A Bad Girls Book of Animals, as a book about wordlessness, and many others have called it also a book about loneliness. And I have seen some recent reviews of the book after its republication, echoing that same sort of sentiment. They agree that it's about wordlessness, about loneliness. I wanted to ask you guys what you thought about that, whether you can accept it, whether you want to push back against it, and something new which I haven't discussed, but just a sort of something that came to me. I feel that my instinct is to push back a little bit on that, and part of that has to do with, I think, a sort of an issue of gender, right? The question of what is a woman expected to do or appear like? Is a woman expected to be wordless and silent? At least in the 1960s, right? And maybe you guys could think about, in relation to that, what do you think about this characterization of her poetry and her work?
I mean, my first instinct is to push back also, and actually to push back against that last idea that Wong May is about wordlessness and lostness. I actually think that the sparseness of her poetry is where the potency is. And it's true that in this collection, there are quite a few speakers who come from quite judgmental families in that sense. So it's quite, I think I used the word unsparing just now, but I think the lostness is not negative, it's not a lack in that sense, and the wordlessness is the silence and the empty space around the words, but still speaking as part of the poem. So she's made it, with those few words, she's just charged the entire page to be part of the poem, so sort of electricity to things. And I don't think necessarily it has to do with gender. I think it is just Wong May as a poet. I think we can sort of give her that claim to universality as well, beyond these identity categories. At least that's my way of sort of pushing outwards instead of pushing back.
I would say, to fine-tune the gender aspect, Wong May is concerned about, is not concerned, but she is writing about gender roles in the book. But I don't think that she is necessarily saying, my perspective is mine because I'm a woman. In fact, she is sort of rebelling against these strictures of what a man should be and what a woman should be. With regards to loneliness, I think there is a distinction between being alone and being lonely. I don't know if I necessarily get the sense that Wong May felt lonely when writing this, but there is a deep waters running in the stillness in which she was producing this work, and Marina Balva as well, which is why I mentioned, like, immediately I connected the two because both are writing in isolation. Yeah.
And this leads me to the third and final preset question, which is, now that the book has come back to life, it's been republished, it's now kind of reaching, at least I hope it will reach a younger generation, many younger generations, right, since the 1960s. How would you guys sort of frame Wong May for an audience today who may or may not be familiar with Singapore poetry? Perhaps they are familiar with poetry, but maybe not Singapore poetry. How do you find her concerns and themes, her style speaking to us today?
I don't think she is as concerned as contemporary poets and readers are about being Singaporean enough. I don't see that anxiety at all in this book. And I like that. Especially, there's a way young poets nowadays write about the Singapore poem or the writing as the Singaporean experiencing life elsewhere that is very instantly recognizable and, for me personally, a little bit annoying. But when I see Wong May talking about American life or home life, wherever home manifests for her, I don't feel so judgy, if that makes sense.
I think just adding to that, I guess the way I would sort of maybe introduce Wong May to audiences who are not so familiar with her would maybe not start with the Singapore angle, because I agree with Jen, it's not about location, it's not about any sort of straightforward sort of pigeonholing of experiences, but I would sort of invite new audiences by saying this is free verse that refuses freedom the way we see it, but uses constraint to make a poem out of it. It sort of readjusts your sense of what free verse might be. And I think if we're going to think about looking at Wong May in relation to other poets, then she has a sort of closer relation with some of the American modernists as well. And one of the poets she has quite a close relationship with is Hilda Maudie, who's one of the Black Mountain poets. And just reading across spaces, but together with form, is one thing I would sort of invite audiences to do, and to sort of not think in national categories or even those lines of tradition, but to think what form can offer us across those lines.
Thanks, and I think now is a good time this is the right time to open up the floor to any questions that you guys might have. You can just pass the mic around. Or if you would prefer, you can use, I think there will be a QR code there. Oh, you can pass the mic.
I would love to hear the three of you respond to the difficulty of Wong May's poems, because actually, if you open it up and you read it, right, the lines are running in very unusual ways. There's also brackets, unended lines, there's no full stop sometimes, things like that. Because maybe all of you, you already have become familiar with this world that she brings you into. So for a reader who is fresh to Wong May, even a poetry reader, because as you say, poetry runs in very familiar ways, sometimes in Singapore context. How did you first respond to this strangeness, and how would you sort of lend a hand to people getting used to this strangeness?
I guess by nomination, I have the mic first. I would just answer. I would say it's, I would point to the visuality of it. I would say this is an Insta poem just to be annoying. And then I will ask, sort of look at this on, and maybe just sort of say, yeah, this might look like an Insta poem, but it's not like it at all. And maybe I won't even say it's a poem, just read it as it is, because the line sort of suggests that you don't need that definition, predetermined category of poetry to read it. I can always give it to someone to read and just read it. Maybe that's still possible nowadays.
What I would say is, I would approach it as I would encourage people to approach any poem, which is the opposite of a sort of close reading sort of paradigm that you might do if you're encountering in a classroom and you write an essay about it. Right? So don't actually worry about what the poem means. Let it flow through you and let yourself feel what the poem wants you to feel. And I think that's a good way to approach any sort of poetry, but especially the kind that is quote unquote difficult. And I hesitate to agree with the word difficult. Maybe strange I do agree with, but difficult not so.
Yeah, I was trying to look through the contents to see what poem I would recommend to a fresh reader of poetry, but I realized it's very hard to pick one because it's like as if Wong May has a poem for every situation, but not a poem for every situation at once. Does that make sense? Yeah. Quite hard, right? But I would say, on the base level, Wong May is an excellent poet because she grasps that you need to be as powerful as you can possibly be in a very small space, right? So every single word in there, even though it's written with a sense of, like you say, no punctuation in some cases, line breaks are in very strange places. When I sang the version of Song, I changed her line breaks actually, to make it more song-like. And yet, I assume from the title that this was the attempt at a song, right? So the way she thinks is just very different and very original. And there's something so lovable about that. Yeah, I think the only way to really understand, to borrow from Anne's just now, the only way to understand Wong May is really to just read her. Full stop.
Thank you. I guess as practicing poets yourselves, I guess what I'm curious to know is, do you guys feel like you've learned anything from reading her? And are there any specific examples in her poetry that have led you to some sort of conclusion or realization about your own practice as poets? That's something I'd love to hear. Yeah.
So I'm going to get personal, right? This book of poems came to me at a time when I thought that I should do my duty as a Singaporean and settle down and get married and be like housewife type person. And then a lot of the poems in Wong May's book are about poking fun at that and wondering to yourself, like, am I a proper woman or not? Is this person a proper man or not? And what does that mean, and do I care, right? So it's not so much learning, but I felt that my own ideas, my own disdain for all these gender roles I felt supported by reading her poems. I felt reinforced in my own idea that it's all a little bit bullshit. Can I say that word? Bullshit.
You already said it.
Like Jen, I guess it's also a sort of a personal thing to talk about my creative practice. And I think last year was a personally difficult time because my mom passed very suddenly. And Wong May talks a lot about her mom in her poems, not just in this book, but in the successive books as well, Reports and Superstition. And for the longest time I couldn't write because everything seemed to have been clogged up. But I think somewhat earlier this year, I was doing some research work on Wong May. So of course I was reading her from sort of academic angle. And the thing that I noticed about her poems is that there's this intense grounding in the body. And you see some of that in this book as well. She talks about the pores of the body, and in another poem in one of her other collections, the pores of the body become the eyes of the body. And you feel that your spirit and flesh at the same time, but in a very organic and very biological way, and in a way that transcends that as well. And I think a little earlier this year, I was rereading her work again after the research had been done, and I started to write again because just looking at her poems, I thought my own words sort of responding to that very corporeal dimension of her work as well. So I have to thank Wong May for that, but I know she's not just that single individual. She's in every one of her poems, and she's wherever her words are read as well. So yeah, I'm going to give thanks for that.
Dario, that's a very difficult question. Maybe for some context, I released a book of poetry recently, and that book took about seven years to write since 2016, and that was like maybe 3 years after I had encountered Wong May's work. And that encounter with it, I think, I didn't know it at the time, but I think it shattered me in a way. It renovated my understanding of what poetry could be. It renovated also the ways in which I thought of myself as an artist, given that she, as an artist figure, is so conflicted about putting herself out there, right? About selling her own work or whatever, promoting her own work, publishing her own work even. And I think it didn't really fully click for me until I started thinking about what I wanted to do for my next book. And it just so happened that when I started writing my next book, it just was very different. Anne says that she thinks that it was that my new book is Wong May-ish, but then after thinking more, she says she disagrees. And I wasn't looking to Wong May specifically in any particular poem when writing it, but I think I was able to be freer, to take myself less seriously, to not worry so much about am I writing an important or good poem, and just write, right? And because of that, I think it has allowed me to become a better poet. It has, I guess, allowed me to let myself get out of the way of my writing, and I think I'm a better poet and person for it.
Hi. To be honest, I know very little about Wong May. I'm just wondering, just based on her age and whether she has made a lot of connections while she was studying at the university here with the other older poets whom we know more of today. And I believe she's maybe a year older than Arthur, and whether they know of one another or might have sort of interacted with one another, and whether if you feel also that there's maybe a little bit of Arthur Yap's influence in Wong May's poems.
I'll take this on. From what I understand, so I wrote this forward in the midst, as part of doing this, I had to dig through any sort of reviews to find about her work. Arthur Yap reviewed Wong May's work. The context is all of them, I think Wong May and Arthur Yap were contemporaries at the University of Singapore. they knew each other. They probably read each other's work even at that point before Wong May had published books. And also, Thang Wu definitely knew about her. He anthologized some of her early University of Singapore writing in volumes at the Second Tongue, as well as 7 Poets, I think. But he tended to favor those poems that she wrote while still at the University of Singapore. So after she left for the US and started publishing these books, I think he sort of didn't think that they were suitable enough for some of the other anthologies he was doing. She was known and she was read, but there was always an uneasy sort of acceptance, not a full acceptance of her as a writer. I think part of it was people thought that she was away and influenced clearly by a lot of American contemporary poetry at the time. So the sort of lineage to Singapore poetry felt weaker, I think, and I think that seems to be how people thought about her work. But a fair number of academics over the years have examined her work. So Ko Tai An, Shirley Lim, they have all sort of looked at her work in relation to other work that was going on at the time.
I mean, it's not a direct relation, but it's also interesting to consider that both Arthur Young and Wong May paint as well. Arthur Young painted as well, and I'm wondering whether that connection between the visual and the poetic has something to do with their poetics more generally as well. But I don't think anyone has done a comparative study of the two poets yet.
I don't even think I've only seen like one painting of Wong May's, and that was because like she was interviewed in the Irish Times and they had covered it. But I cannot find any of her paintings online otherwise, so I don't know what she paints. Yeah, she uses a different name when she paints.
So maybe I have a question. I don't know Wong May at all until Mr. Fan said that. But you talk about painting and poetry. I'm just wondering from your perspective, do you think you would approach poetry very differently if you also painted as a pursuit?
I feel like I want to echo Jennifer. Because although Jennifer does paint, she does visual art, broadly speaking.
So,
I think my personal opinion is that to be a good poet is actually to have at least an interest in all the other art forms. Because poetry, as compared to other forms of writing, takes into consideration the visual, the space and the placement of words. It also takes into consideration sound, so the audio aspects of sibilants, assonance, all that sort of thing. I feel I'm going to offend a lot of poets when I say this. I think the kind of poet who says, I only write poetry, I only do words, and I'm only interested in this art form, and I'm blinkered to all other art forms, is seriously losing out and in terms of making their poetry richer. Yes. To tie it back to Wong May, I didn't know that Wong May was a painter. Since there are 2 poems in here actually called Song, one is called Song and the other is called Spring Song, I would have thought maybe she wanted to be a rock star at some point in her life. Yeah.
Maybe she is.
You have a third name.
I think it's a really interesting question, whether painting allows you to see different planes. If you're writing about the same subject and painting about the same subject, whether the two are speaking to each other. I've never done it myself, so I don't think I can speak from personal experience, but I can see how that might work for Wong May, who was very much influenced by the expressionists, and her last collection, Picasso's Tears, is an obvious sort of pointing towards that direction for consideration as well. So her later poems are even richer in terms of the way they refract perspectives, even more extensive and more ambitious than what we see in this book. So definitely for Wong May, that seems to have been an essential part of her practice.
What I would say is that I've never known any poet who hasn't been interested in other art forms, even if it's not to do it, but just to appreciate it or to consume it. And I think, so as a roundabout way of answering your question, my latest book is very in-depth to the visual arts. Part of it is because a friend, Ivan, who's a really good painter, a really good visual artist actually, he does collage work, and so I was very fortunate to be in his studio observing him do his work. And I found a lot of resonances with the way that I write my own work. So he's a collage artist, so he has a trash heap like in the corner of the studio where he has put like discarded scraps of things he's printed out, newspaper, even old work that he's like pulled apart and like thrown into the trash heap. And he takes bits of it, puts it up, tears it off, so that you leave a trace of the tear behind, like paints over it, that kind of thing. And to me, it felt a lot like how I was working with poetry, like quoting, deleting things, taking from different sources. And I feel like maybe Wong May, I mean, I don't know what Wong May's process is like at all, but I think some of the ways in which she uses images, turns of phrase, feel like a similar process perhaps, of taking from different times, different areas, and kind of smashing them into a startling, surprising relation. Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, it's what came to mind.
Thank you for sharing all three.
Can I ask another question? You mentioned Picasso's peers, and some of her books are really hard to get in Singapore, so I've not read a lot of the other books. Can you make a comparison between the writing style in the latest collection of poetry as compared to this first book of poems?
I don't have an answer prepared, so I'm just going to say what comes to mind. So I feel that A Bad Girl's Book of Animals is also in part a sort of reaction to, response to the Iowa style or Iowa approach to writing. So the backdrop of this is that she left Singapore and moved to Iowa City, where they have this sort of if I'm not wrong, the first ever MFA or Master of Fine Arts creative writing program. And she enrolled in that program. And part of the approach to this is that they take the poem or the short story as something like a chair, like a piece of furniture. And everyone comes into the workshop to kind of work on a piece of furniture together and kind of script it out, or do things with it. So they have this workshop model. And I feel that Wong May sort of didn't fully accept that way of doing things. So if you see, this is, okay, then I'll read you the last poem, okay, and I'll explain why I say what I say. It's called A Lesson. And if you are familiar with some of the sort of things that people say in creative writing workshops, you'll understand what I mean. A lesson. Extinguish fox eyes, extinguish violets. We will have no leaves, no dead roots for this autumn. No God walks the north hills. The air at this moment is saying just this. There's a justice in this. Say it, purity. The stars kill each other with it, nightly. I think it can be done. I want a man to judge without being unjust. Describe winter, I say, without snow or cold or north. Use no white for white. He says it cannot be done, but it is given, and mostly as punishment. Alright, so in creative writing workshops, sometimes you say like, okay, I want you to talk about winter, but no, you cannot use the word snow, cold, white, that kind of thing. And they call it show, don't tell. And I think that this poem is a way of like pushing back against that, because this book would have been very likely developed as part of the thesis for her MFA. So that's all to say that this is her the book where her poems are the shortest, the most compressed. And actually, as she publishes it, as we get to Picasso's Tears, the poems become very, very long. There's an enormous kind of like really moving. So Picasso's Tears, the poem, is like a book-length poem all on its own. It takes up like 30 pages in the book Picasso's Tears, and it's essentially about Guernica, or the monumental painting that he did about the war. Yeah, so to me, I think she has developed in a way that shows that she's rebelling against this idea of short compressed lyric. Yeah, what else can I say? I think she has become more European. Maybe this is probably because my bias, because she lived in Europe and settled in Dublin, where she still lives today, and she has said for herself in an interview that if she had stayed on in the US, she would have progressed very differently as a whole, but then she moved to Europe. And to me, I think that also is part of it. So some of the references, the kind of figures that she looks to become a bit more European. So you have Porcelain, Simone Weil, all these like European writers that she increasingly looks towards, and she kind of name drops in an interview at the end of the book, Picasso's Tears.
I thought I would say a little bit about reports and superstitions as the in-between books between Abacus Books of Animals and Picasso's Tears. And in those collections, you can see her responding quite clearly to the big events of the day. So East Bengal is a poem that responds to the famine in Bengal in the 1960s, and she also talks indirectly about the Vietnam War. So sometimes I think Wong May is read as a poet simply as a poet, but she is very much engaged with these issues on her own terms in her politics as well. And she has travel poems, but not in that direct way as well. So I think it is in Superstitions you have perhaps one of only two directly Singapore referencing poems, which is Kampong Baru 1975. But it occurs in a long string of other travel poems as well. So I think she does get more place-specific in the sort of middle collections too. So and then to Picasso's Tears, more European. More ambitious. She also has a sequence called Wandersee, which is based in Germany, written in Germany. Again, it's a 15-part poem, so you can see her poems getting longer. And also, I think she's experimenting quite clearly with what a poem is, refusing the page as the unit of a poem. I think so. Very, very exciting.
I have only read this book, A Bad Girl's Book of Animals, and you should read it too.
Do we have any last questions? Even from the panelists as well, if you have questions for each other.
I want to ask Hao Guang this question because he mentioned it to us, over dinner, that Wong May described this republication of her first book as a sort of homecoming, right? Or it would assuage her homesickness. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, okay, thanks for reminding me this. I forget that not everyone has heard of this anecdote. So this was actually Erin's story originally, I think, because Ethos or Erin wrote to Wong May to ask for a form, to sign, get the contract signed and everything. And when she replied positively, she said, maybe I'm not quoting her exactly, but she said something like, I'm glad that Ethos and Hao Guang are willing to bring this out. To me, it sort of assuages my homesickness for Singapore. There are many things to say about this. I think the first thing that came to mind was a bit of a sadness because clearly the Singapore that she's homesick for doesn't exist anymore. And maybe that's also why she doesn't come back to Singapore, right? And that's part of it. But also I think to me it showed that she did care for the book to be read by Singaporeans, right? Even though we keep saying, oh, she don't lump it in this box or whatever, there's something about, she actively wanted this book to come out. And it meant something to her that it came out with the Singapore press. Yeah, and to me it was a sign that it was like a positive affirmation of this republication. It wasn't just, oh, if you like it, just go and do it, you know what I mean? So she was actively saying, yes, I would like this to happen. The other part of it is that she also quoted T.S. Eliot. She said in 4 quartets, I think, he said something like end is my beginning. And to me, it's a bit, she seems to be suggesting that this is the twilight of my life, and it seems like there's this new beginning in her debut book being published here. So that was an additional sort of moment for me. And I also recall her mentioning in an earlier interview that even before she had any English, or she grew up in a Chinese-speaking household with very little English. She encountered another T.S. Eliot poem. Perhaps it was also 4 Quartets, but I think it's the one with the Lady of Silences, so yes, it's 4 Quartets. So she encountered the Lady of Silences in T.S. Eliot's poem and felt enchanted by it. Right? So the fact that she kind of returned to Eliot with that quote also felt like it meant something, although I don't know whether she was actively thinking about it. So thanks for that question.
Alright, if you have no last questions, if you would like to speak to the speakers after this, you can ask them questions privately as well. But yeah, thank you so much for